Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating global paradox. When you picture Africa's demographics, what's the very first thing that pops into your head? It's highly likely you think of it as a fundamentally young continent, right? And hey, you wouldn't be entirely wrong. But as we're about to see together today, you wouldn't be entirely right either.
Pretty much universally, Africa gets labeled as the youngest continent on Earth. If you follow demographers or the global media, they constantly frame Africa's future exclusively around its youthful median age. We hear nonstop about a massive youth bulge, a booming workforce, and this incredible promise of a demographic dividend. It is absolutely the dominant narrative out there.
But hold on, because the actual data presents a massive plot twist. 18%. In a rural community in Limpopo, South Africa, researchers studying a population-based cohort discovered that a staggering 18% of adults aged 50 and older are actually living with dementia. To put that into perspective, that figure is drastically higher than the typical 5 to 7% we usually see in the global north for similar age ranges. It's a completely different reality than the one we're used to hearing about.
So let's dive into Section 1, the Young Continent's Paradox. This is exactly where the youth bulge meets an aging reality.
Take a look at these UN projections for older adults, meaning folks 65 and up, in sub-Saharan Africa. The growth here is literally explosive. We go from 41 million in 2025, more than doubling to 103 million by 2050, and then reaching an astonishing 460 million by 2100. So while the overall percentage of older individuals might stay under 10% for a little while, the absolute numbers are just skyrocketing. We're looking at a quiet wave that our current systems are completely unprepared for.
And this brings us to a quote that really hits the nail on the head. The growth rate of the older population in sub-Saharan Africa will be faster than anything the wealthy world has ever experienced. Think about the wealthy world for a second. Countries like Japan or Germany had decades, literally generations, to slowly build up their pensions, specialized hospitals, and long-term care systems. Africa's aging wave is arriving at an unprecedented speed, totally without that running start. It's a shift that's going to fundamentally rewire global health and economics.
Moving on to Section 2, the healthcare delivery gap. We are vastly unprepared for the shift from infectious to non-communicable diseases.
Let's zoom in from those macro numbers and look at the clinic level. This gap is perfectly captured by the HAIL-C study. This is rigorous, highly detailed longitudinal data from Agincourt, South Africa. It proves definitively that aging conditions are highly prevalent, filling a massive data blind spot in global health. For decades, the global health community basically operated as if older populations just didn't exist in Africa. Well, this study completely destroys that myth.
Now, when we scale that data up across the map, the forecasts are downright alarming. We're looking at projected dementia increases of 200% in Southern Africa and 300% across Central, Western, and Eastern Africa over the coming decades. Let that sink in. The data we just talked about from South Africa, that's just the very beginning of a continent-wide trend.
So with all this looming, how are the health systems actually responding? Spoiler alert, with a massive delivery gap. Right now, sub-Saharan public health budgets are essentially stuck in the 1990s. Roughly 80% goes straight to infectious diseases like HIV and malaria, while only a measly 20% is left over for non-communicable diseases. Systems are heavily funding infectious threats while almost entirely ignoring the rising tide of stroke, diabetes, and dementia that comes with an aging population. It's just a wild mismatch between what's funded and what's actually happening on the ground. Which brings us to Section 3, the missing pension net. Why current retirement systems are failing the majority.
Okay, prepare yourself for a pretty stark comparison from an Aga Khan University study covering 14 sub-Saharan countries. Healthy life expectancy sits at 57 years for women and just 53 for men. But the pension eligibility age, that is set at 62 for women and 63 for men. It highlights a truly tragic reality. Many Africans spend 5 to 10 years in poor health or even pass away before they ever reach the age to claim a single pension payment.
And when we zoom out to the broader population, I want you to burn this number into your brain. 6%. That is the shockingly low formal pension contribution rate in sub-Saharan Africa. When you compare that 6% to the global average of 32.5%, you really begin to see the true scale of the economic vulnerability here.
So why is it only 6%? Well, because 91% of sub-Saharan African workers literally cannot save for old age through formal channels. They're working in the informal economy. They're in agriculture, or they're market traders or boda riders working without payroll or formal contracts. This deep reliance on the informal economy means that a 35-year-old worker today has almost zero probability of a formal pension waiting for them in 2055.
Let's look at Section 4, the eroding family care model. Basically, the collapse of the traditional safety net.
To truly grasp the pressure this economic situation creates, we just need to look at Nigeria, the continent's most populous country. 171%. That is the staggering projected increase in Nigerians aged 65 and over by the year 2050 alone. That is a massive impending burden falling squarely onto informal family care models, and overwhelmingly, that burden is placed on the shoulders of women.
But here's the catch. This is where the social story collides head-on with the demographic one. Research out of Berkeley identifies three main forces actively eroding this traditional safety net. First, falling fertility rates mean fewer children, and therefore fewer caregivers per elder. Second, women are entering the formal workforce in record numbers. And third, rural to urban migration is physically separating young adults working in the cities from the elders who remain in the villages. So the safety net is collapsing right as the aging wave hits.
All right, moving to our final core topic, Section 5, the demographic window. This is our brief period to build an economy for an aging future.
So the solution to all of this lies in a concept called the demographic window. If you aren't familiar with it, this is a finite period, typically about 30 to 40 years, when a country has lots of working-age adults and relatively few dependents. If you invest properly during this time, you get rapid economic growth. And the good news? Africa has this window open right now, but it is a strictly limited time frame to build infrastructure before the dependency ratio flips and the aging begins in earnest.
Seizing this window isn't just a guessing game. It requires 4 specific evidence-based actions. 1. Implement universal, tax-financed social pensions, so the 91% in the informal economy simply aren't left behind. 2. Reorient health systems toward geriatric and non-communicable care, and do it immediately. 3. Design age-friendly urbanization. Now, we're talking building cities with public transit and accessibility for the elders of 2066. And 4. Invest aggressively in African aging research.
And speaking of research, well, we run into an incredibly small yet massive roadblock. 24. A recent mapping review identified just 24 longitudinal aging study datasets for the entire sub-Saharan region. 24 datasets. For a region that will soon house nearly 500 million older adults. It really emphasizes our massive data blind spot. We were essentially flying blind into a storm we know for a fact is coming.
Now, before we wrap this up, I really want to push back on this whole ticking time bomb narrative. Because as this quote beautifully highlights, older Africans are the unpaid teachers, the community memory, the agricultural backbone of millions of rural households. We absolutely cannot view this demographic shift purely as a catastrophe. Elders are not just burdens, they are the vital pillars holding society together.
Which leaves us with one final, kind of haunting question. In 2070, when 460 million older adults look back at us, what will we say we did with the window? The policy infrastructure simply must rise to meet a population that is already quietly arriving. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If this structured look at the data gave you a new perspective on Africa's future, definitely share it with someone else, and let's keep learning together. Catch you next time.